see you all. Hello, I'm Alice Hutchinson, the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut, and I'm honored to be the host of Write America. The aim of this series is to help set the country back on a correct, productive course of freedom, justice, equality, and plain human kindness. Write America is a literary series created by author Roger Rosenblatt, featuring award-winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers in readings and conversations each week about how books and art might bridge the deep divisions in our nation. Write America celebrates the quiet power of art in our lives, the unifying power of the highest uses of language. In novels, stories, essays, and poems, we recognize one another as parts of the human family, one family. Roger Rosenblatt, the creator of Write America, puts it this way: writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. So with that, I welcome you. And please join us Monday evenings at this time as many of the most beloved and distinguished writers in the country read from their works and talk to each other and with you in an effort to bring us together. If you missed our last episode with Frank Bedart and Richard Tillinghast, you can go to Birds Books' Write America page and link to the episode easily. As most of you know, Write America will wrap up its 2-year run at the end of January 2023, and the recordings will reside on our Write America YouTube channel for you to watch at any time. Tonight's episode is also being recorded, so if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch. The link is right on the front page of our website. Tonight, we are hosting readings by and conversation with Alice McDermott and Jill McCorkle. I will return at the end after the readings and discussion to bring your questions and comments to the authors. During the episode, please feel free to make comments or ask questions in the chat, but we do ask that you remain muted, however. Our first speaker is Alice McDermott. Alice McDermott is the author of several novels, including Ninth Hour, Someone, After This, Child of My Heart, Charming Billy, winner of the 1998 National Book Award, and At Weddings and Wakes. That night at Weddings and Wakes and After This were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. Her stories and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, and elsewhere. For more than 2 decades, she was the Richard A. Maxey Professor of the Humanities at Johns Hopkins University and a member of the faculty at the Sewanee Writers Conference. Her essay collection, What About the Baby? Some Thoughts in the Art of Fiction, was published in August of this year. Her forthcoming novel, A Bigamous Daughter, will be released in February of 2023. Please welcome to the screen, Alice McDermott.
Thank you, Alice. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
I am. Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this wonderful gathering every Monday night. Thank you, of course, to dear Roger for getting all of this started, and to Lindsay, who does so much wonderful work behind the scenes. I'm going to miss this gathering at the end of next January, but I love hearing from Alice that all these readings will be archived. So if we're feeling lonely, we can go back and listen in on so many of the wonderful conversations that Write America have brought us. I went through my my files thinking what would be appropriate to read tonight, looking to see if I had a story about storytelling or maybe a story in keeping with the season, and dug up this very short piece that does both. So I'm going to read this and then just a little exegesis appropriate to Write America, I hope. So a short story. I think it's unnamed. I've just found it in my files and it just had copy. And I don't think that was it. I could call it Miracle on 34th Street, but I think that's been done. She was 6 or 7 that year. And if memory served, sometimes it did and sometimes it didn't. All the cliches about old age being as dishearteningly accurate as they were. It was a particularly cold Christmas Eve in the city. She gave the story a Dickensian spin. A particularly cold Christmas Eve in Manhattan, getting on toward dusk and her toes aching with all the walking she had done in her thin leather shoes. They had taken the train in from Brooklyn, she and her two sisters and her big brother, and they had met their mother at her office in Midtown, there to be shown to the man their mother worked for. She recalled being ushered into his presence, pipe smoke and leather and dark woods, the man's large hand extended and her mother poking her in the small of the back to get her to step forward and shake it. A silver dollar distributed to each of them. Lovely children, he had said. And then into the elevator and out into the cold again, buoyed by their satisfaction with the encounter, by their satisfaction with what they saw as their own limitless charms. Over to St. Patrick's to light a candle, and then down the length of Fifth Avenue. It was nearly dark then when they reached Gimbel's. And to give the story a Dickensian turn, she added a wet snow and the thin black tire tracks of the cars in the long avenues, the yellow fairy circles of street lamps alive with falling snow. Following her mother and her big brother and her squabbling sisters into Gimbel's, just running in, her mother had said, before they got on the train to head home. Pretending as she walked that an argument had begun between her 2 feet in their good Sunday shoes, one foot saying, "Let me go first," and the other saying, "No, me, no, me," over the muddied threshold of the store, absorbed by the game she had devised out of the simple study of her own footsteps. Me, no, me, no, me. Until she looked up to discover that the good cloth coats she was following carried on their shoulders the gross, pale faces of utter strangers. "You were lost," her nephew said from the front seat. It was another Christmas Eve, and they were driving through the dark after dinner in town, a small country town somewhere in the Adirondacks where he and his partner had their new home. The road was narrow and winding, edged with thick trees. They had already made 2 wrong turns. "Lost," she said, and raised her gloved hand and then dropped it into her lap, where they had placed a lovely mohair throw when they'd left the restaurant, tucking her in. To her right, her daughter stirred, perhaps with impatience. It was possible her daughter had heard this story before. To her left, her niece said, "Poor you," sympathetically. Memory or nightmare, even memory of a nightmare, what could compare with the terror of being a child lost on Christmas Eve? The impulse to scream moved up out of her aching toes. But something of the decorum of her mother's hushed and lovely office building, something of her mother's quiet pride in the way they each had stepped forward and taken that strange man's hand and said, as they had been told to say, "How do you do?" kept her silent, even in her terror. Kept her measured in her steps as she continued walking, 1 foot in front of the other, making no game of it now, lost. She saw her nephew glance briefly into the rearview mirror. The road was dark and winding, and he was driving carefully. They had already seen the silhouette of a crossing deer. He and his partner had moved up here from the city only last fall. Walking calmly, the scream perched at the back of her throat, she had at last remembered to do what she had been told to do, and found a woman who looked nice. A woman not unlike her mother, standing at a counter, examining silk stockings lifted out of a thin box. She touched the woman's coat, and the woman leaned down to hear her. She wore a lovely perfume. There was a scurrying then. The sales clerk stepped out from behind the counter, and then a man in a suit appeared, and then another elevator ride. And although she had no memory of anything but the dry weight of the scream at the back of her throat, she supposed she was actually crying by then, because they took her to a nurse who, here memory grew vivid again, gave her a piece of gauze to dry her tears. Not a tissue? Her niece said. Not a tissue, she said, but a piece of gauze instead to dry her eyes. The nurse saying that if she didn't stop crying, she would soon wash them all away with her tears, wash everyone out of the nurse's office and into the hallway and down the elevator shaft, where they wouldn't be found until after Christmas, since the store was about to close. She smoothed the blanket they had spread over her knees when they left the restaurant. She was too warm with it on her lap, with the 5 of them in the car, and the heat turned high for her sake, she understood, frail as she had become. The store was about to close, and she would spend Christmas alone among strangers, accepting a piece of rough gauze to dry her tears when what she needed was her mother's large handkerchiefs smelling of peppermint, enduring their silly jokes about washing everyone away when what she wanted was her brother and sister's warm teasing. Feeling the scream perched at the back of her throat, while decorum and politeness, the good intentions of these strangers, kept her silent. And then what happened? Her nephew asked, glancing again into the rearview mirror, the green dashboard lighting the reflection of his eyes. She was never found again, her daughter said dryly. They all laughed. Mom was raised by a tribe of sales clerks from Gimbel's, didn't you know? She smoothed the mohair blanket on her lap, pulled herself away from the shoulders of the 2 women on either side of her. She folded her gloved hands. There was a certain dry weight at the back of her throat. They found her, of course, her mother and her brother and her 2 sisters. They burst into the nurse's room, scolding and laughing. They were restored to me, she said. And then she added, giving her story its Dickensian moral, on Christmas Eve. Isn't that the whole point of the angels? She listened to the low hum of the engine as the car made its way in the darkness and the cold. If everyone is quiet when you stop talking, her mother used to say, then you've been talking too much. Of course, she had told the story before, had told it, in fact, just an hour ago over dinner. Outside, above the thick trees, there were the eternal stars, always brighter on Christmas Eve. It was one of the cliches of old age that the past burned brighter than all the rest. Nevertheless, there they were, restored to her in the telling of it, the whole point of any Christmas story. Her mother, still youthful in her business suit, and her two bossy sisters in their Sunday clothes, and her big brother taking her in his arms, riding her home on his shoulders. That's Christmas. And the second piece I'm going to read, very brief, is something I was asked to talk about by the good people at Penn Faulkner just this past October. For the first time, the Penn Faulkner people here in DC held a literary State of the Union and gathered all of us, so grateful, all of us, to get out of our lonely little offices and actually be together with real people at the Willard Hotel. And they asked a few of the writers there to say a few words about our literary State of the Union. So apropos to Write America, the state of our literary union. Certain bleak quotations come to mind. It's tempting to say, for instance, with W.B. Yeats, that in 2022, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Or with D.H. Lawrence, the sympathetic heart is broken. We stink in each other's nostrils. Or with William Faulkner, our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up? Or perhaps, when will I be blown away by an unregulated AK-47 or a 500-year storm? Given the present state of our literary union, it's also tempting to acknowledge that Faulkner was racist and sexist too. I recently learned that on the very day he died, his beleaguered wife went out and bought an air conditioning unit for what was now her bedroom alone. A gleeful realization on her part, I am sure, because he had banned air conditioning from the house while he was alive in Oxford, Mississippi, no less. We might also declare in this, the centennial year of Ulysses and the Wasteland, that T.S. Eliot was anti-Semitic, and poor, repressed Jimmy Joyce never quite understood the creepy ramifications of his leering male gaze. It's worth noting as well, I suppose, that the censors who once plagued Joyce are having a heyday still. School boards on the right, sensitivity editors on the left, morality clauses in our publishing contracts, even if there's nothing of the sort in our politics. In brief, in 2022, it's tempting to say that we are a mess, all of us, readers and writers, critics, creators, consumers, citizens, the quick and the dead. We're all vain and troubled and biased and fearful and angry and despairing and shallow and stupid, unrepentant, reprehensible, self-righteous, indignant, intolerant, endlessly foolish. Which leads me to propose that the State of the Union is pretty good for the likes of us. Because, honestly, what stories would there be left for us to tell if all of our fellow human beings were now and always had been perfectly wonderful. The good news is our union is rife with drama and comedy and heartache and foolishness. All the stuff of great literature. So go read and go write, and Happy New Year. Thanks. Alice.
Alice, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Jill McCorkle. Jill McCorkle is one of the first authors ever published by Algonquin. Jill's first two novels were released simultaneously when she was in her early 20s. Since then, she has published 6 novels and 4 collections of short stories. 5 of her books have been New York Times notable books, and Life After Life was a New York Times bestseller. She has received the John Dos Passos Prize for Excellence in Literature and the North Carolina Award for Literature. Her stories have been included in the Best American Short Stories and the Norton Anthology of Short Fiction. Her most recent novel, Hieroglyphics, also published by Algonquin, was released in 2020. Please welcome to the screen, Jill McCorkle. Let me find you, Jill. Where are you? There you are. Don't forget to unmute.
There we go. Thank you so much, Alice. What an honor to be here. And other Alice, bravo. I look forward to, I want a copy of that. It needs to be spread far and wide. Thank you. And a big shout out and thanks to Roger for what he has given us. You know, at the beginning of COVID, I think I wrote to him early on, not that I'm a football fan, I'm not, but I said it beats the hell out of Monday night football, just to have that regular event to tune in. And I have really enjoyed it. And like Alice, I'm thrilled that the archives will be there. So thank you, Alice, Lindsay, Roger, for giving us this. I'm going to read part of a story because there's no way I could get there. But I will hopefully I promise I'll find a good spot to stop. It's called Old Crimes. It was June 1999, and they were at a family inn in New Hampshire. It was not the romantic weekend spot Lynn had imagined when Cal invited her for a quick getaway between sessions of summer school. Just being away, he had said, that's what we need, right? Lynn nodded, even though she was not feeling the togetherness at the moment. Just the away, out in the middle of the woods in an old farmhouse with the prefab wing of rooms like a rundown motel. The walls were covered in dark paneling, and there was a faded floral bedspread, shades too small for the windows, and a 40-watt bulb in the one lamp on the dresser. The food in the dining room was family style with very little choice. The room filled with trinkets and little wooden signs everywhere. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Bless this mess. And in the bathroom, we aim to please, you aim to please. There were tattered pinwheels and Pepsi bottles on the tables, a Cupid doll by the cash register, and things she had not seen in years, like pastel-colored growing rocks in a fishbowl, a dried-up sea monkey container, and a Cabbage Patch doll dressed up like a sailor. There were more toothpick holders than she had ever seen gathered in one place, and something about it all, the early American decor, eagle decals everywhere, and empty bird feeders, all the stuff, left her feeling like life had slowed, clicking like a dying engine, and then stopped. Needless to say, they were not partying, as Prince had suggested they would be doing at the end of the century, back when they were kids growing up hundreds of miles apart. Him in a cushioned suburban, well-educated life in the Northeast, where things like the right schools were always at the forefront, and her maneuvering the backside of the Bible Belt with all the baggage and guilt often inherent in that. No expectations of anything beyond high school graduation until the guidance counselor, barely out of college herself, insisted Lynn try. You have choices, the young woman kept saying. You can go anywhere. Lynn had met Cal out in front of her dorm the very first day. He was 2 years older and would graduate the next year. Although on break, both had brought a stack of books along for the weekend. He was studying to take the LSAT, and she still wasn't sure what she wanted to do in life, but knew he would be more impressed if she also had a stack of books. She was barely 20 and thought it was mean that her college advisor was saying she had to declare a major, something that he also said would definitely affect the rest of her life. The high school guidance counselor had made it all sound so simple, and it was anything but. Still, she had taken a lot of courses she found interesting, even when her grades didn't reflect it. She had taken one in forensic archaeology and another in ethics, and the two together had left her thinking of all the many mysteries that remain unsolved and perhaps always will, not to even mention all that remains unknown and buried under ice and volcanic rock in peat bogs and the greatest depths of the ocean. On a whim, she had taken a creative writing class, even though she had used up all of her electives, and her advisor kept saying that her courses were not leading toward anything, and that if she didn't buckle down, she would not be able to graduate in 4 years, and her financial aid would likely not be extended. His voice sometimes sounded like a lawnmower in her head, muffling anything from past or present that sounded like a reprimand or judgment. She had had enough reprimands and judgments to last a lifetime. Besides, she was the first in her family to even go to college, so whatever happened, she had at least done something. She had made that choice. That was what she told herself at the end of each day. She made a B in the class. Some good ideas, but nothing thought through, the professor said, but had continued to think about one of the exercises that was assigned at the end of the term. Pick an object, pick a place where that object exists. Imagine a person in that place with the object. Then they were supposed to imagine a different person in that place with the object, and then another and another. How many variations, different characters, different situations, different stories might evolve. It was amazing how something so simple could quickly become complicated. She chose a belt for her object because in her archaeology class, she had already been assigned to track something through the ages that people take for granted. At first, she had wanted to do hats because she loved hats of all kinds, even though too self-conscious to wear them, and was inspired by that one famous bog body on the cover of one of her textbooks, the Tolland man, ancient and frozen, and wearing a little pointed cap, a detail so simple and personal that it filled her with sadness. But when she began researching it all in the library, the history of the hat quickly became a lot more complicated, way more work than she wanted to do, though she never would have told Cal that. But the Tolland man was also wearing a belt, and it seemed clear that was the easier pursuit, not to mention it offered far more action than the hats would have, the word alone suggesting action. A belt could be a song or a drink or a slap. The belt, looping and connecting since 3300 BCE, leather, suede, satin, and silk, rope, brass, cord, notched, cinched, buckled. It was a fashion statement, a utilitarian transport for tools and treasures, an object grown-ups could use to threaten children, It was a murder weapon, binding hands and feet or wrapped around the throat. A belt, a room, inside a room, behind a door, a man takes off his belt. That was her sentence. Who is the man? What is the situation? Is anyone else in the room? Cal had already unbuckled his belt and stretched out on the bed in their tiny dim room. We have a commitment for now, he had said, anytime there was discussion of the future. Isn't that enough? But she wasn't sure. She had set the clock in her head, something she did often when making a decision, giving herself time, but knowing when the alarm sounded, she had to act, make a decision, leap. The clock was always ticking. All choices have consequences, her guidance counselor had said. It's not about right or wrong, but what's right for you. She told herself that when the alarm sounded, she would decide. Was she just another notch in his belt, or would they live ever after, either happily or not? Would she be able to not get hurt, not do something she would regret, not be judged? Before the conversation about their relationship, the drive had been pleasant enough, with many sights to see along the way. They ate lunch while watching a trained bear show, which he said was unfortunate, but she kind of liked, but didn't say so. I mean, bears on bikes. It was impressive. And then they had spent the early afternoon hiking through a gorge formed 200 million years ago. And then they had spent the early afternoon seeing the old man in the mountain, a famous rock formation like a giant man's profile, godlike, watching over the land. His profile had been on license plates for the state and storefront signs, and famous people had traveled far to stare up or write about him. And then they had arrived at the Turner Family Inn, and there was a waterfront, as the ad had said, but it was a very long hike through the woods to get there. And then there was no beach or place to sit, and it was muddy, bugs on the filmy surface, a Martin house listing to one side, and a rickety dock. And they didn't see any other people at the pond or in the woods. Much of the forest had been clear cut, stubs and stumps everywhere, and there were dangerous looking spikes with yellow plastic ties like an old crime scene. Yes, exactly like a crime scene. And she said so, only to have him shake his head and sigh. Why do you always see the worst possibility, he said. And she wanted to ask how he could not see those possibilities. How did he not see? But she felt vulnerable in the inquiry and remained silent. Oh, the aching gills to live in such a pond, a slow evaporation with no rivulet leading to a better place. It reminded her of all the bog people in the book, in particular the Eid girl murdered and tossed away in the Netherlands in 54 BCE, her blonde hair stained red by the tannic acid. The facts: a girl about 16, 4.5 feet tall with scoliosis, was murdered and thrown in the bog. She was not far from the village. The woven spring she had likely been wearing on her hair wrapped tight around her neck, and she died of strangulation. There were no signs of struggle, which meant the stab in her shoulder happened after. And then she just stayed there, preserved by the bog, until some working men found her in May of 1897 and completely freaked out. So much unknown. Was she sacrificed to some god? We're praying for a good crop, so here's a dead girl. Was she banished and executed because she had scoliosis? She's not like the rest of us. Or was it just that bad things had always happened to young women walking through the woods? These big teeth, the better to eat you with, my dear. Dead already? So here's an extra stab. If I had a gun, I'd shoot you too. What Lynn had learned is that evil and violent things had been happening since the beginning of time. There had always been people who wished others harm. There had always been innocent people sacrificed. Who knew this place would be so run down, Cal had said. But he didn't offer that they should consider an alternative, and he didn't apologize for his choice, even after she flushed several dead roaches down the sluggish toilet. The only hand soap was a thin wafer wrapped in plastic that smelled of disinfectant. Now his pants and belt were draped over a chair, and he patted the place beside him. She pulled her hair up in a high ponytail and stretched out, causing both to roll to the center of that way too soft mattress. And it was hot. The wind had died, and the oscillating fan provided little relief. The touch of his skin to hers was unbearable in the moment, just too hot in a room that already smelled soured and old. Of course, he reminded her, this is luxurious compared to what Pete and Roy are doing. His roommate Pete was in Ghana, and Roy was working in a camp for delinquent kids in rural Tennessee. She knew she should admire that, and she did, she really did, but she also knew so many people probably like those at the delinquent camp that she couldn't imagine choosing to be there. And was it so bad to long for things like a nice hotel with a clean pool, to dream of a candlelit mahogany paneled cocktail lounge with a piano player, plump stuffed chairs and heavy cut glass vases and fragile champagne flutes like in the movies? Or what about a balcony looking out at the sea, any sea? She worried that she was not as socially aware and involved as everyone else Cal valued in life. She had seen so much firsthand and didn't want to look back. Had he figured this out, or did he just hear in her silence an echo of his own voice? And then out of nowhere, a child appeared at the door. Her yellow t-shirt smeared with dirt and what looked like ketchup. Her hair was a tangled mess. She announced that this was her birthday, June 6th, and she was 6 years old. 6 on 6/6. Mama says, sign of the devil. She asked where they were from and how long they were staying. Were they married? Did they have a baby? Did they think they'd be eating the candy bar her mama left there by the bed? Lynn handed her the Milky Way that looked like it had been parked bedside for years, tattered wrapper and rock hard. The child ripped the paper away, one eye closed as she bit into it and then chewed with her mouth open, a dribble of chocolate on her plump cheek. She stood admiring Lynn's red suitcase and clearly wanted a closer inspection. Chocolate and dirt-stained little hands reaching all around. She said her name was Jane and her mama owned the place. I'm Jane Doe, she said in a gruff voice and laughed. She had a wide space between her front teeth and dark brown eyes, like doe a deer. She pointed at a picture hanging on the wall beside a fly swatter and said the hunting dog in the bottom right corner was named Bobo and had eyes just like her daddy. My daddy is nice like Bobo, she said. He licks my hand like this. She licked the back of her own hand, leaving a chocolate stripe there. Lynn wanted to ask, did she mean her dad or Bobo licked her? But the child had moved on and again was touching everything. She lifted the lid of the suitcase and peered in. Cal asked, didn't she need to be going somewhere? But she just shrugged and shook her head, and it seemed she was getting ready to get up on the bed when they heard a man's voice calling her name. Come here right now, he said. We've told you not to bother people. She put the half-eaten candy bar down on the bed and gave an exaggerated sigh, crossed her eyes and tongue extended, then stomped away, letting the screen slam behind her. Finally, Cal said, his arms around Lynn's waist and pulling her toward that marshmallow bed. But she stayed by the window and watched, the girl taking her time to get to the man standing there, hands on his hips and cap pulled low on his forehead. Get in that house, he said, and yanked her by the arm. We're tired of you bothering people, and if it happens again, you're going to get it. He pushed her toward the main house and then turned away, missing the way she stuck out her tongue, wagged her little hips, and then shook her middle finger at his back. Surely he wasn't the dad with eyes like Bobo. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, that's ominous.
A little, yes. And it gets more so, but you know, Alice, the first thing I thought is your brilliant lecture I heard you give years ago about not having these these dead girls. And I threw the Eid girl right in there, but it goes in a different direction, I should say.
Oh, an occasional dead girl works. But I was thinking more about how brilliantly you build objects in your stories. Everything. It's what I'm reminded of questions that that readers often ask when they say, yeah, you had those toothpicks in there. Did you intend that? You know, and when I listen to your story, I know you intended all of it. Just this beautiful building of a world where everything resonates with, we're not quite sure yet what, but meaning is there.
Well, I was thinking the same with your beautiful Christmas story, because we are so in that world, you know, just the tire tracks in the snow, and it really has that fairy tale quality to it, and with that a kind of ominous fear as well, I think, and especially when I learn where she is, you know, with her memory, and that feeling of being just completely lost. And
so
I think that's
telling the same story over and over again.
exactly. Because I feel like that's where our two pieces overlap there, with this feeling of just being in a place and lost in it. And her daughter, that line, I love that we laugh, you know, when she says, yes, mom was raised by the Gimbel, the salespeople. And you both laugh and just feel this awful heartbreak for her.
Well, you know, I was thinking at the beginning of your story, and probably something that made me worry about my own little piece, but it's that it is the fear of telling a story that's been told, but also making use, and you're making use of the year, you're making use of the turn of the century in your story, and sort of grabbing those. It's Christmas, it's New Year's, it's a birthday. There's a little girl with her 666. It's the turn of this, you know, those moments that, yeah, in reality, these are the moments when we pause and we remember, and we tend to pull things together as you're doing in your story. But then there's also, I don't know if you feel this, that, yeah, but that's been done. You know, the millennial story, the Christmas story, the New Year's, the birthday story, the New Year's story. And so I guess I'm wondering, you know, do you allow yourself, you know, you say, okay, yeah, because experience tells me these are moments when things happen that make for story, or do you just plow ahead and say, as I've had students say to me, yeah, I know lots of people have written Christmas Eve stories, but nobody's ever written one like this.
Yeah, you know, I think we claim the stories by the individuality of the character. And so we all go through the calendar year. So we all have claim to those holidays. But then what's different is whatever's behind that personal life. I mean, for me, just the detail, that wonderful detail of the mother nudging her in the back to step up and meet the man who is the mother's boss. And that was a little ambiguous, you know. I mean, my mind is sort of racing as to what that relationship is and what it means to the mother. And it could mean many things to the mother to make this good impression. We don't know. We just know it's very important. And that, you know, what makes this night different from all others, you know.
The storyteller's question, always. Yeah. There's something else that I really loved in your story that I think maybe addresses something that I was trying to get at in the literary State of the Union. And I love Lynn sort of recognizing her own failings. Maybe she's not the altruist that his roommates are, but is it so bad to want a balcony, a real ocean, a clean room? And I think of this as very typical of your work, and something that I love about it, that you have such a clear eye for the foibles and the sins, so to speak, but also an understanding of our own need to be forgiven and to forgive, and sort of acknowledging that. And I guess maybe in 2022, our literature maybe either is too hard on all of us as human beings, or is reluctant to ask for forgiveness or compassion for characters who don't seem to deserve it. That sense of these people are really no good, you know, and you know, reader, if you're sympathizing with them, that's your fault, or writer, if you're sympathizing with them.
Yeah, I mean, your statement is so brilliant. And I think if I thought about all of those things when I was working, you know, am I being sensitive enough? Am I doing this or that? I wouldn't be able to write a word. Because, you know, the story ends up being about someone, you know, sort of raised in really strict kind of Bible belt mentality, who's trying to pull it all together, and then, you know, witnessing in the life of this little girl sort of a kind of life that she would just as soon leave behind. And yet, you know, we never really escape anything, you know. So in many ways, I see the little girl as kind of a haunting in a way, of just a kind of love.
And she's sort of awful, but there's also a sympathy for her that's not sentimental. There's I mean, she's tough. I love it that she's, you know, she's flashing a finger behind not the dad's back, but there's also, and maybe this is coming from the writer's, the narrator's voice, because she's seeing something in this child, but there's an element of forgiveness, or an awful kid, you know, no less in her awfulness, and eating the chocolate dripping, the saliva dripping from him, still awful, and not sentimentalized, but somehow the narrator is allowing us subtly to see her humanity and something that they might understand about one another.
Definitely, definitely. And
But
I
isn't
mean,
that hard to do? I mean, isn't it? I mean, don't you sometimes when you're creating a character, just this is an awful character, and I want everybody to know this character is really awful. And you know, do you have to sort of push yourself to say, yeah, but
yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I was just, again, you've got the niece, just like the angel and the devil's on the shoulder. You know, you've got the daughter who's heard it a million times and is going to lean into the sarcasm, and you've got the niece who's showing compassion. And there are always those two sides. I mean, that's why I actually, the story actually grew out of an assignment, because I thought, for an exercise, that sentence, "In a room behind a door, a man takes off his belt." And I gave that assignment because, and the story goes forward with other examples. I mean, it can be just a calm, passive, tired person at the end of the day. It can be punishment. It can be sexual. It can be, and I'm just kind of drawn by that kind of ambiguity of something so simple that we take for granted, you know, that we all, you know, go into our space at the end of the universal day, but it's your space, your clothes, and it becomes very intimate. So that's what I was going after. And
yeah, well, what you do with the word, I mean, all the things that belt can mean, a slap or a drink, and then all the kinds of, I mean, again, I guess that reminded me of, you know, yeah, reader, pay attention, because here's a writer who knows why she's choosing the words that she's choosing. And she's giving you a clue right here, because think of all, you hear belt and you think one thing, and yet our language, you know, isn't this the wonderful thing about it?
yeah, I mean, and I was thinking, you know, I was doing belts and hats, but you were doing shoes, and that wonderful game she's doing with her feet, which again, claiming that personality, you know, that this child, that's how she's dealing with these cold feet, and just the way you described the shoes. And it does have that Christmas Eve, little match girl kind of feel to it, of just being lost. And I'm drawn to what you do with memory and the way you move back and forth, with the memory there. I still assign that night so often to the students. But in recent years, the ninth hour has been a go-to, because what you do with the point of view there from a first person memory into this world and then back, and it's so seamless and beautiful, the way you move between characters, and you make it look completely easy. You know, even in the car, you know, going to the nephew, and it's just the briefest look in the rear view. But
you know, you say that about memory, I'm interested to ask you, because these two things, all the things that the ordinary objects in the story, that of course aren't ordinary, that are selected, and with some purpose, and sometimes with very complex purpose. Belts and hats and shoes, and the hat on the man in the bog, and the resonance of those simple objects and how they build through the storytelling. And I know I'm terribly biased, but when I read that in a story like yours, and I hear you talking about that, I want to say that's what fiction does. And it's not quite the same. Maybe poetry does it too. Yeah, it's fiction and poetry do that. Journalism and memoir, not quite the same way, not quite with the same intention. And I know I'm going to get in trouble from all the memoirists and the journalists and the nonfiction writers. But I just, it's the thing that makes me love fiction so much. It makes me go back to it again, not just that it's a story or that there are characters I can identify with, but with the way words themselves can be manipulated and made to do so many things other than simply advance the story. So is it my bias to say nonfiction writers and non-poets don't quite have the freedom to do what we try to do with words?
Yeah, because what I find so exciting with revision, it's the small work, it's the little mosaic, but then, we get to do that really fun, I think, fun part where you then back up to see the whole and to shape the whole. And so this story does zoom forward such that it's in someone's memory. So those dates do play back, and that's the kind of thing you don't always know when you write that first draft.
Right.
A lot of times it's the backwards glance.
And so they become, the details become transformed by the story itself into that something more than just parts of the whole.
Yes.
Yeah. Hello, Alice.
Hello,
Hi,
Alice. Hello, Jill. I was tempted to let you go for another hour.
Oh,
Oh,
well,
what a
I
great
just have to
discussion.
cheer again for Alice's statement at the Penn Faulkner, because it's brilliant. And you say so much about, our freedom to write and the need to really go in there full force.
Well, speaking of writing, what advice would you give to someone writing their first book?
I think that's what I would say. Jump in, I tell my students, I like to pretend that maybe no one else will see what I've written. And at the end of the day, if I want to burn it, flush it, throw it to the way, I can do whatever. Just that kind of ultimate freedom with the first draft, and don't, try to get into the body and the voice of the character and not question what someone else would say about that choice. Just go with it.
Yeah, and I think more and more, because we're so inundated with opinion and talking heads like the three of us tonight, telling us what to think, and we're getting interpretation of events before we've quite even been informed of the events. And I think the freedom of fiction is to be able to say, I'm not here to convince you of anything. As the writer, I'm here to, as Conrad says, make you see, to sort of reaffirm our collective experience through a very specific experience, but not to editorialize, not to make you a better person, or make me a better person, or prove that the writer's so smart or that the reader is so brilliant for picking up the book, but just that that celebration of language and its ability to mean multiple things and to reach us in ways that the simple telling of events can't get at. It's a wonderful freedom, and I do find a lot of young writers feel that they have an obligation to editorialize, to prove something, you know, and even if at the end of the day something has been proven, that's not the place to start. The place to start is, as Jill says, that immersion into language, and the way language can both reproduce and transform our collective experience of life.
Well, speaking of other writers, do you have any emerging writers or unrecognized writers that you want to shout out? Because, you know, there's so many people writing that we may not have on the radar. Anybody come to mind? Just off the top of your head?
Well, of course, I think of former students because my students are so brilliant. A wonderful writer named Jane DeLury, who published a book a few years ago called The Balcony, which is complex and amazing for a first novel, for any order novel. And she has a new book coming out, I think in the spring, called The Hedge, which is also wonderful, very talented. Just one of those novels where she's like a juggler with 16 balls in the air, and you read The Balcony thinking they're gonna fall. She's gonna no, she does. She pulls it off. It's
That's
wonderful.
I'll look out for it.
So will I. That's wonderful. I'd like to give a shout out to a first story collection coming out this spring. Lisa Cupolo, Have Mercy on Us.
I'm writing because I love hearing what I have not found or discovered. So thank you so much for sharing both of those with us. I want to know what each of you is reading now. What's on your nightstand?
I just read Michael Parker's new novel, I Am the Light of This World. Beautifully written, and one of those you can't afford to say too much. It gives away, but it's it's a heartbreak of a story, and just so beautifully written, and you know, I'm always amazed when someone does that. You know, you're reading something that's almost, you know, too painful to bear, and yet the language is so beautiful you can't put it down. So he definitely mastered that. And then I have Doug Bauer's The Beckoning World is on top. So I'm looking forward to that.
Thanks. Alice, what are you reading?
I'm actually just a little bit into Russell Banks' new novel, The Magic Kingdom, which is just out, and it's just wonderful. Talk about just sit back and watch a master tell a story.
I'm excited to read that one.
Yeah, it's just wonderful, and it is. I really do have that sense of just, oh yeah, this is how it's done. I don't have to worry. I don't have to, you know, I can put down my pen and just be a reader. It's absolutely wonderful. And I'm also sort of, because I've been away from academics for a while, I'm slowly making my way through Brad Lighthouser's, I have it right on my desk, book Rhymes Rooms, which is a seminar in poetry. And so I've been going to it as if stopping by a class, and reading a little bit, and then going off and reading more of the poets. So that's a wonderful book. I would think if a great gift for any young writer, or
Ooh, thank you for the commercial.
yes. Speaking of which, I just received today, talk about the new
Wow.
Prize, filled with absolutely wonderful poetry, fiction, memoir. Another great gift for young writers,
Of course.
the best of the small presses. We got to help those
Absolutely.
small presses. We need them to thrive.
Well, ladies, our time is up. I hate to cut this off because I've enjoyed it so much, as I'm sure everybody else who's joined in as well. So I'm going to bid you adieu. I'm going to mute you and minimize you. And I'm
Thank you. Thank you
Of
so much.
course. Of course. I'd like to thank Alice and Jill for participating in Right America this evening, and to everyone who tuned in tonight. And thank you to Roger Rosenblatt for creating this original and important series to look forward to each week. Tonight's episode is the perfect example of the purpose and mission of Right America. We hope to see you all on Monday, December 12th, next Monday, as we welcome Francine Prose and Billy Collins, which will end our 2023 episodes, and we will rejoin you in January for our last 4. Please remember to check out Bird's Books Right America page, where you can find out information about our upcoming episodes and maybe purchase a book or two. Thank you so much.